Hello, humans and lizards. Welcome back to this Not Writing Advice channel. I hope you stay a while and listen to a Komodo dragon talk about things related to writing but are personal in nature and may not apply to anyone else. For this week, I am going to talk about environmental storytelling. Environmental storytelling is the practice of having the location and set dressing of a story do part of the heavy lifting of the narrative. This is something that will usually be used in video games, because players are often guided through the game environment and will end up seeing most of it. This allows the developers the opportunity to use these areas to hint at elements of the setting or foreshadow future areas or challenges. If the developers include things like background conversations, they also gain a way to flesh out minor elements or build a sense of the lives of the people in the game that a player might otherwise just plow through. Now, one might wonder why I am going to talk about a practice done in video games when I am a writer. Games are a very visual media and the written word is more reliant on imagination and evocative language. All of this is true, but I believe that there are lessons to be learned from environmental storytelling that can apply to writing. One way to use environmental storytelling I have learned is in support of the arc a character goes through. An excellent example of this is with the 2013 reboot of Tomb Raider. The game starts with Lara Croft in a confined, restrictive jungle area. The environment is dark and the terrain is difficult, with Lara nursing an injury and moving slowly through an already challenging area. One of the early hostile encounters in the game are wolves that attack her, forcing her to defend herself. This helps convey the sense of fear, of being lost, and of feeling weak and helpless. The environment helps set the mood and tone, even before Lara discovers the real horrors of the island. As the game continues, Lara ascends. Her movement through the various environments is largely vertical. As she ascends from the site of the wreck and through a dark and stifling jungle, she emerges into more open areas. The environment stops being so dark and the sun becomes more prominent. There is more light and the spaces feel more open, with Lara gaining tools to overcome the obstacles in her way. The environment opening up reflects how she has adapted to her situation and how she gains her confidence while navigating the environment and the dangers it presents. Even if we don't hear Lara speak very often, the player can feel her confidence and newfound strength just by getting around. The environment is as much part of the player seeing Lara's growth as the mechanics. Another game that excels at using the environment to help tell the story is Dark Souls. One good example is Aner Londo, the seat of power of the gods filled with examples of grand architecture. The ceilings are high, the buildings tall and imposing, with a sense of grandeur and spectacle in their design. This creates a sense of awe and shows a society at the height of its power without explicitly saying so. The sun and bright sky also help with this perception. If the player takes the necessary actions to shatter the illusion covering the city, suddenly the environment becomes as dark and decaying as every other area in the game, and while the architecture is still grandiose, players can feel how suddenly empty and lifeless they are. It shows a place that has fallen from where it once was, with all that remains being crumbling ruins and fading memories. While Tomb Raider uses the environment to support and reflect the positive character arc that Lara goes through, Dark Souls uses the environment to hint at the past. It attempts to create a sense of awe at what was achieved, and then a sense of loss once the truth is revealed. The environment of Aner Londo tells the story of a kingdom that rose and fell, but leaving the player to imagine how that fall came about. Even players who ignore the various storytelling elements included in the game still get a sense of the overall story of Aner Londo just by looking at the environment and exploring it. And that, to me, is incredible storytelling. As a writer, I try to emulate ideas like this in my own writing. How I do this will vary based on the needs of the given story I am writing. However, I find that the easiest way to achieve this is through the use of description. It doesn't have to be overly detailed to achieve the right effect, so long as the environment is described with the correct words. For example, describing the silhouette of a castle as being like a claw tearing through the clouds and grasping for the moon conjures a particular mood and image. It manages to both evoke a slight sense of dread and hints at the genre of the story being read. This same effect can be achieved by using unusual choice of verbs for everyday things. This can also set expectations very quickly. If a narration says a door is opened, most readers will assume it opened normally. If the narration says a door dilated open, it throws off those assumptions and creates curiosity. What kind of world is the story set in, that doors open by dilating? For an example from one of my novels, I mention sometimes that shadows bleed instead of form, to show that the gloom cast over the environment is not a natural state. How an ordinary environment is described by your characters can also reflect their personal arc. Use negative descriptors of the environment or objects to suggest that the character is at a low point, that they are unable to see the positive in the world. As the character goes from low to high, change how things are described to more neutral ones and eventually into positive descriptions. The details should remain consistent. A room with two doors and archways meeting at the center of the ceiling should not suddenly lose these features, but the way the narration shows the reader these features should reflect on the state of mind of the perspective character. This can work in third-person perspective better than first-person, since first-person is more tightly bound by what the narrator is concerned with and has less room for details that the character doesn't care about or won't notice. One final thing I learned when it comes to using environmental storytelling in writing is to let key ideas or words fill in part of the weight of setting up the story world for you. This one is something I learned both from video games and the Japanese traditions around the subject matter of a haiku. The idea is to use words that act as markers, indicating the time or place where a scene is set. If your narration mentions a convenience store, it sets the scene and informs the reader the story is in a modern urban environment, because that is where people usually find convenience stores. They can picture all the details without you having to do it for them. Doing this has been especially useful for me in two ways. One way is that with the setting explained in an efficient manner, I can instead focus on the point of the scene. The other way is it helps highlight anything I describe that is out of place, making it appear more important by virtue of going against the mundane expectations the marker has set. To use the above example, the mundane convenience store suddenly becomes less mundane to the reader if you have a green-skinned, tusk-toothed goblin walk in. What happens next will differ based on what kind of story you are trying to tell. Environmental storytelling is not limited to the unknown and the exotic. It can be used even in the mundane modern world that everyone is at least familiar with. An old mansion might be described in a manner that reflects the slow decline of the family that lives in it, with monuments to past glories and fading signs of outdated features that used to be state-of-the-art to symbolize how the world has left them behind. A great medieval castle undergoing a renovation might be a metaphor for the owner taking pride in his family heritage but wanting to move with the times. Of course, these are just my thoughts. I am no expert on the craft of writing, but I like to think I have learned a thing or two. What I learned may or may not apply to anyone listening and has a chance of being completely wrong. But then, no one should come here for writing advice because there are better places to go for that. Who would want to learn how to write from a vicious predatory lizard, anyway? That is all for this week. Thank you for staying until the end. Consider clicking the like button or subscribing, maybe even leaving a comment to tell me how wrong I am about something. Or you could look in the description, where you will find links to where you can purchase my books. This is your resident Komodo dragon, signing off.